You feel it late at night, not as a thought, but as a nausea. That subtle sickness behind the eyes. Like something sacred was sold while you were smiling. You scroll past your own post. You see your own face, your own caption, your own curated victory. But it doesn't register as real. It's a ghost, a projection, a monument to a moment that never belonged to you. You chase success, but it's not the building you crave. It's the balcony, the place where others can see you, applaud you, invent a myth out of your motion. You built the illusion well, the grind, the discipline, the curated authenticity. You were effort like armor and praise like oxygen. But you can't sit still. You can't go silent, because silence means absence, and absence means erasure, and erasure is death to the ego. So you move, not toward anything, but away from the terror of being unseen. You say you're ambitious, but you check the views more than the blueprint. You say you're disciplined, but your focus cracks without feedback. You say you're free, but you orbit approval like a desperate moon. The ego isn't your identity. It's your advertisement. It isn't built to lead. It's built to seduce. And you've let it become your compass. Here's the fracture. You want to be admired, but you don't want to be known. You want to be envied, but you don't want to be touched. You want to be watched, but only on your terms, through your lens, in your light. You don't crave success. You crave spectatorship. You don't want the truth. You want the role. You think you're chasing purpose, but you're rehearsing. Every step a scene, every sentence a script. You look in the mirror and see a version of yourself you've never met, but can't stop performing for. Freud said the ego is not master in its own house. What he didn't say, the ego built that house out of glass, and now you can't stop cleaning the windows. You maintain the illusion of control. You design the narrative. You market your journey. You polish your progress like a weapon. But deep down, you know, this isn't you. It's your survival mechanism, dressed in hustle. It's your wound, disguised as willpower. Every post, every pitch, every pixel of personal branding. It's not creation, it's containment. A way to keep the chaos quiet. But the silence doesn't last. Because no matter how polished the image, the ache seeps through. The part of you that knows, none of it was for you. It was all for the watchers, the imagined crowd. And the cruelest twist? They were never watching. They were scrolling. And now you're left performing for ghosts. This is the cage. You designed it. You locked yourself inside. And now you call it identity. But identity built for attention will always be hollow. And eventually, the performance will break. And when it does, you'll be standing alone in a costume that doesn't fit. In a room that never loved you. Holding a script no one's reading. This is the horror behind your habits. You don't fear failure. You fear being unacknowledged. Invisible. Unwitnessed. You've replaced inner alignment with outer confirmation. Turned growth into theater. Turned reflection into broadcast. Turned solitude into starvation. And in doing so, you've trained your soul to speak in captions. Your will to respond to applause. Your meaning to depend on mirrors. But mirrors distort. And you forgot how to look inward. Because it hurts. It always hurts. To see what the performance was protecting. To admit that the grind was camouflage. That the mission was noise. That the self you sold was never real. That's what makes this moment dangerous. Because something in you knows the lie can't last. Something in you wants to tear it down now. The brand, the mask, the ego. But something else is terrified of what's underneath. No edits, no filters, no story, just you. And whatever's left when the watchers are gone. We grow up believing that self-expression is liberation. That to show yourself is to free yourself. But Freud knew better. He watched the mind squirm under its own spotlight. He saw how the ego doesn't reveal the self, it censors it. It trims the edges, softens the rage, hides the hunger. What you call you is just the version your ego can tolerate. Polished, predictable, palatable. Because underneath, there's chaos. There's the ID, the raw, primal drive. The hunger that doesn't want to be liked, it wants to consume. The rage that doesn't want to be healed, it wants to destroy. The desire that doesn't want permission, it wants dominance. Freud didn't romanticize the self. He knew we are not guided by reason. We are dragged by need. Your ambition? Often just fear wearing a mask. Your confidence? A defense mechanism that learned how to smile. Your goals? Designed not for fulfillment, but for protection. Protection from what? From the unbearable truth that you are not in control. You think you choose your path, but your choices are shaped by forces you don't see. Childhood fractures, buried traumas, silent expectations. You say you love the grind, but who taught you that rest is weakness? Who convinced you that worth is earned in suffering? You say you want to inspire, but who benefits from your addiction to being watched? The ego isn't a truth teller. It's a liar with good posture. It will build an entire life around a trauma and call it a calling. It will bury shame in success and call it strength. You say you're building your future, but look closer, you're just protecting your wound. Here's the trap. The more you succeed through performance, the more you reinforce the mask, and the more praise you get for the mask, the more dangerous it becomes to take it off. You become a prisoner of your own persona. You feel it when you post and wait, when the numbers stall and your chest tightens, when the applause fades and you panic, as if your existence depends on that digital breath, because it does. To your ego, silence is death. But real freedom begins where the ego dies, not where you become something more, but where you stop pretending to be anything at all. Freud called it repression. We call it self-control. But most of your discipline isn't growth, it's avoidance. You suppress your impulses, not to master them, but to maintain the image. You don't meditate for stillness, you do it for status. You don't journal for insight, you do it for identity. You don't heal to be whole, you heal to stay relevant. Even your pain becomes content. Even your solitude is a performance. You believe you're working on yourself, but the self you're working on is imaginary, built not from truth, but from what you think others will respect. That's the lie, that you're being authentic. But your authenticity is algorithmic. You dress it in honesty, but it's engineered. You call it vulnerability, but it's staged. You think you're connecting, but you're just performing a higher resolution illusion. And the most tragic part? It works. People believe it. They praise it. They follow it. They never question that your glow is artificial, because they're doing the same thing. This isn't a world of individuals. It's a theater of survival. Everyone performing, everyone watching, no one living. And you wonder why you feel hollow, why the applause never lands, why the milestones feel like shadows. Because they were never yours. They were never real. They were rituals in the religion of the ego. And the ego doesn't seek truth, it seeks worship. It doesn't want to be free. It wants to be adored. But adoration is poison in disguise. It tastes like power, but it rots your instinct. And when you finally realize that, when you see the lie you built your life around, you don't feel enlightened. You feel sick. Because the mask doesn't come off clean. It tears skin. It draws blood. It exposes how far you've drifted from yourself and how many sacrifices you made. Not for purpose, but for applause. You hit the wall when the noise stops working, when the metrics flatline, when the energy you've been manufacturing collapses under its own weight, when you realize you've been living inside a marketing strategy that pretends to be selfhood. This is where most men lose themselves, not in crisis, but in exposure. Because once you've seen the engine behind your identity, you can't unsee it. You can't lie to yourself the same way. And worse, you can't believe what used to comfort you. That's when the symptoms intensify. Sleep breaks. Appetite shifts. Attention shatters. Your system is trying to purge the false narrative. Not spiritually, neurologically. Freud didn't design a path out. He didn't offer escape. He just mapped the machinery and left you alone with it. But the blueprint was clear. The ego does not lead. It reacts. It adapts. It edits. The ego's job is to keep the story intact. Even if the story is broken. Even if the story is killing you. Once that function gets exposed, it doesn't evolve, it panics. It doubles down. You start performing authenticity louder. You overcorrect. You add realness. You post breakdowns, confessions, raw thoughts. But it's still ego. Still calculated. Still curated. This is the next trap. You think exposure equals transformation. But it doesn't. Seeing the mask doesn't remove it. It makes it heavier. Because now you know it's false, and you still can't stop using it. That's the fracture point. Where knowledge doesn't liberate, it humiliates. Because you've built your life on a system that can't allow you to be free. If your value comes from being watched, then solitude feels like failure. If your strength comes from being praised, then stillness feels like death. So how do you move? Not with motivation. That's just a tool the ego hijacks. Not with hope. That's just permission to delay. Not with self-love. That's just another brand of illusion. Freud's real tool was confrontation. Not change confrontation. Bringing what's hidden into view. Not for healing. For precision. You stop asking, why do I feel lost? And start asking, who benefits from me staying this way? You audit your actions like a criminal profiler, not a seeker. Who are you performing for? Whose script are you acting out? Which part of your identity gets rewarded, and by whom? When you map that, things break. Fast. The friendships that only survive your mask fall apart. The routines that only work for your ego collapse. The systems built on external reward turn to dust. What's left is not a higher version of yourself. What's left is discomfort. Raw, unprocessed discomfort. The part where you don't know what matters anymore, because what used to matter was fake. Most men quit here. They go back to the lie. Pretend the insight never happened. Recommit to the role. Sell the illusion harder. But the few who keep walking through it, they start making decisions the ego can't explain. They leave the job that made them look powerful. They stop broadcasting their evolution. They say no to things that made them visible, but never real. It looks like collapse, but it's something else. It's the ego losing control of the house. And for the first time, the real self starts making decisions. Not the pure, glowing, enlightened version you've read about. Not the healed masculine. Just the honest one. The self that doesn't care how it looks. Doesn't need to be witnessed. Doesn't perform pain or monetize growth. It moves differently. Quietly. Without explanation. That's not transcendence. That's threat detection shutting off. That's the system no longer fighting to be liked. Because once the ego is disarmed, the need to be right disappears. The pressure to be exceptional dies. The addiction to being perceived fades. And now you have room to choose. Not based on applause, but based on alignment. This isn't liberation. It's reconstruction. The hard, slow rebuilding of a life not designed for validation, but for function. Freud never promised peace. He just gave you the weapon to see through the mask. The rest is demolition. The collapse doesn't fix you. It just removes the noise. And when the noise dies, the structure underneath becomes visible. Not spiritual structure, behavioral. Freud didn't believe in reinvention. He didn't preach rebirth or alignment or masculine energy. He mapped systems. And in your system, the ego is not the driver. It's a PR department, a negotiator, a mask with a memory. It doesn't create, it reacts. And if you let it run the show, it'll build a life optimized for appearances, not outcomes. Rebuilding starts with subtraction, not cutting out distractions, not detoxing apps. That's surface level. What matters is stripping away mechanisms that reward ego instead of utility. Ask, what actions still make sense without an audience? Not many. Most of your routines are rituals designed to be seen, not to be useful. The gym, the journaling, the morning walk, they all collapse when there's no one watching. So stop pretending they're sacred. They're performances. And that's fine. Just stop lying about it. Freud would call this the beginning of the return. The ego loses power when it's exposed as a compensator. Once you see it for what it is, a noise filter, a social mask, it becomes something you use, not something you serve. You stop feeding it. You stop asking it for guidance. You stop designing your day around its insecurity. The rebuilding happens in silence. Not metaphorical silence. Actual silence. Without music. Without input. Without constant stimulus filling the gaps between actions. Because in silence, the unconscious starts leaking through. And that's where the real signals are. Freud's theory of the unconscious wasn't mystical. It was mechanical. Repressed drives show up in compulsions, slips, rituals. You don't discover your purpose by thinking. You watch your behavior in stillness. The urges that remain, those are real. The impulses that disgust you, those matter. The fantasies you hide, those contain truth. Not moral truth. Not destiny. Psychological truth. You want strength? Look there. Not in vision boards or clarity workshops, but in the raw impulses you don't post about. That's where the reconstruction starts, not in what you admire, but in what you conceal. Because your real self doesn't live in your goals. It lives in your aversions, your rejections, your disgust. This is where most men flinch, because what they find isn't noble. It's primal. And Freud warned, the unconscious isn't a peaceful place. It's a furnace. Power doesn't come from integrating your light. It comes from mastering your chaos. But mastery doesn't mean indulging it. It means understanding it. When you understand your rage, you stop acting it out unconsciously. When you track your envy, it stops shaping your choices. When you admit your fear, you stop overcompensating with performance. This isn't healing. This is system alignment. You strip the ego of its role as interpreter. You stop asking it to justify your pain. You stop letting it spin stories to preserve your image. You replace performance with pattern recognition. What behaviors repeat when you're insecure? When you're alone? When you're ignored? What routines fall apart without attention? That's the data. Because after collapse, clarity doesn't come from vision. It comes from refusal. You refuse to act out patterns that belong to the mask. You refuse to perform strength you don't have. You refuse to outsource meaning to metrics. You stop using the mirror. You start using consequence. You rebuild based on what works, not what looks good. And this is where power starts to return, not in the feeling of being in control, but in the absence of panic when control disappears. The ego flinches at silence. The self doesn't. The ego requires feedback. The self requires focus. Freud's framework was brutal. You are not one mind. You are a conflict system. ID, ego, superego, primitive impulse, social mask, internalized authority. You don't find peace by aligning them. You find peace by knowing which one is speaking and why. And once you can track that, you stop being a puppet. You stop chasing validation because you feel the source, not noble ambition, but childhood hunger. You stop performing discipline because you know the function, not growth, but control. It's not about fixing yourself. It's about removing the distortions. And most distortions come from believing the ego's voice is yours. It's not. It's a panic system built to maintain image, not integrity. And when you stop obeying it, your real values start to emerge. Not slogans, not mottos, behaviors. What you choose when no one's watching. What you pursue when no one's clapping. What you protect when no one can see it. That's identity, not the one you present, the one you act on. And rebuilding begins there, not with what you want to become, but with what you stop pretending to be. You'll be tempted to rebuild the mask, not because it worked, but because it was familiar. Because even false structure feels better than no structure at all. The ego wants the comfort back. It will suggest a new version of itself, more subtle, more honest, less obvious. You'll think it's growth. It's not. It's a rebrand. Because the ego doesn't disappear. It adapts. It watches you shift towards silence and reshapes itself to fit the new tone. Now it wears minimalism. Now it speaks in shadow work vocabulary. Now it pretends to help you deconstruct itself. But its goal hasn't changed. It still wants to be seen. It still wants to be applauded for doing the work. It still wants the image, just a new one. You'll post about not posting. You'll market your detachment. You'll show restraint as content. And in that moment, you'll feel it again, that nausea. Because you know exactly what's happening. This is where the system becomes transparent. You no longer mistake authenticity for truth. You no longer mistake expression for selfhood. You no longer mistake awareness for change. You understand what Freud laid bare, that most of what you call growth is actually self-deception with better language. You're not building a new self. You're building fewer illusions. And fewer illusions means fewer places to hide. So here you are, not healed, not enlightened, not clean, just exposed. You see the mechanics now. You watch the ego shift shape. You see the performance as it forms. And this time, you don't stop it. But you don't believe it either. You let it pass. Like weather, like instinct, like hunger. And in that moment, you're no longer inside the ego. You're watching it from outside. That's the shift. Not control, not transformation. Just distance. Enough space to choose something else. It won't feel heroic. It won't feel final. It won't feel complete. It'll feel quiet, unremarkable. And that's how you'll know it's real. The ego feeds on spectacle. The self doesn't need an audience. So now the question isn't what you'll do. It's what you'll stop pretending to do. You can still chase. You can still post. You can still build. But this time, the ego doesn't get the wheel. It gets the passenger seat. You track its voice, but you don't obey it. You hear its needs, but you don't serve them. You use it like a tool, without letting it shape your identity. And when the old patterns return, you don't panic. You just recognize the system. Because that's all Freud ever gave us, recognition. No escape. No arrival. Just the clarity of seeing the machine. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. Everything you do from here will carry that tension. But it's yours now, not the ego's. You're the one watching. And that's enough. Now, leave a comment, not for visibility, not for performance, but as a confession. What part of your identity do you suspect is just performance for an invisible crowd? Not what you've healed, what you still hide. Let's see what happens when we stop polishing the mask and name it.